You're standing at your front door. It is early. The sun has not touched it yet. There is that particular quality to the light. Not quite dark, not quite morning, where the world feels held between two states. You put your hand on the handle and stop. Just for a second, you stop. Maybe it happened this morning. Maybe it happened last week. Maybe it happens every single morning, and you have never let yourself examine why. Something in you hesitates before crossing that threshold. Something says, wait. Something says, look at the frame first. And then the moment passes and you open the door and you step out and you tell yourself, it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Notice what that hesitation actually feels like. It isn't fear exactly. Fear has a direction. It tells you where to run. This is different. This is more like a hand placed gently on your chest. Like the moment before you say something important and you realize you don't quite have the words yet. The body registering something the mind hasn't caught up to. Something that says, this place, this exact frame, this exact inch of wood between inside and outside, matters more than you know how to say. Your body knew. It always knew. You just didn't have a name for what it was telling you. That instinct, that brief wordless pause at the threshold before the sun finds the wood, is one of the oldest impulses in human memory. Older than the house you live in, older than the street your house stands on. And what Solomon understood, what he traced with his own hand on his own doorstep in the hour before dawn, is that the threshold is not just where the outside begins, it is where everything dangerous has to ask permission. If this kind of history, the history that lives in gestures, not in books, is the kind you come here for, consider subscribing. The way YouTube works, the algorithm only keeps bringing you this content if you signal you want it. And there is much more of this to come. Signs, seals, practices so specific and so old, they have almost no name left. Subscribing is how you make sure it reaches you. Now, let's go back to that door. There is a particular kind of unease that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive like grief or fear. It arrives the way a draft arrives. Sideways when you weren't looking, through a gap you didn't know was there. You moved into this house and something felt different within the first week. Not wrong exactly, just open. Like a window left slightly ajar in a room you never use. You couldn't say where it was coming from. You checked the locks. You cleaned. You burned something fragrant and told yourself it was just the adjustment of a new space. But the feeling didn't leave. Or maybe it wasn't that. Maybe it was the mark, the one on the doorframe. A scratch, geometric, deliberate, that you noticed one morning and couldn't stop thinking about. The neighborhood kids, you told yourself. But the lines were too precise, too intentional, and they were positioned in a very specific place, not on the door itself, but on the frame, on the boundary, right at the threshold. You photographed it. You searched. You found nothing satisfying. What you found instead were fragments, a Reddit thread about similar marks, a forum post from someone whose grandmother used to trace something in the air before crossing the doorstep at dawn, an article about discoveries in a cave in Nottinghamshire that mentioned symbols near the entrance. None of it connected into something you could hold. And that is its own particular kind of frustration, not the unanswered question. You could live with an unanswered question. It was the sense that the answer existed, that somewhere, someone had already understood this and put it into words, and the words were simply not reaching you. Like a conversation happening in the next room that you could almost hear, but not quite make out. The fragments were real. The instinct connecting them was real. The gap between them was simply the distance between a tradition that has been practiced and a tradition that has been explained. Here is what connects it. In 2019, a team of volunteers at Creswell Crags in Nottinghamshire, a limestone gorge with caves that locals had feared for centuries, believing they were gateways to somewhere beneath, began documenting what was already there on the cave walls. For decades, most of what they found had been dismissed. Modern graffiti, people assumed. Casual scratches, random marks left by bored hands. Then the experts arrived. What they had found was the largest collection of protective marks ever documented in the United Kingdom. Hexafoils, 6-petaled forms drawn with a compass in a single continuous line. Intertwined loops that never broke. Marks placed not randomly across the cave surfaces, but deliberately, overwhelmingly, around the entrances, at the thresholds, at every point where the outside world crossed into the space that people needed to be safe. These were not decorations. They were not accidents. They were architecture, spiritual architecture, placed with intention by hands that understood something we have spent several centuries trying to argue ourselves out of. The threshold is not neutral. The threshold is the most dangerous point in any protected space. It is where whatever wants in has its only chance. Think about what that means for a moment, not as an abstract claim, but as a material fact about how these things were built. The people who lived in those caves did not carve those marks lightly. Carving into limestone takes effort. It takes a decision. It takes returning to the same spot, in the same low light near the entrance, again and again, with the same tool, adding to what was already there. This was not an afternoon's impulse. This was a commitment, a maintenance, a relationship between a community and its threshold that was renewed, deliberately and physically across generations. And not once did they mark the middle of the cave. Not once did they mark the back wall, the high ceiling, the comfortable center where people slept and cooked and kept children warm. Always only the entrance, the frame, the exact point where outside becomes inside, because they understood what Solomon understood, what the Solomonic manuscripts record with the same precision in a different language, centuries and thousands of miles away. The interior of the protected space is safe precisely because the boundary has been tended. Remove the tending, and you remove the protection. It is not symbolic. It is structural. And Solomon knew this. I need to tell you about the first time I understood what my mother was doing. I was in my late 20s, finishing a semester at SOS, working through a collection of Solomonic manuscripts that had made their way from a monastery in northern Ethiopia into the university archive. Fragments, mostly. Pages separated from their original volumes. Some damaged, some so faded, the text required careful work under specific lighting just to read. On one of those pages, there was an illustration, a doorway, and traced onto the doorframe in the illustration, drawn in ink that had oxidized to the color of old rust, was a symbol, a continuous line that crossed and looped and returned to its origin without ever breaking. I stared at it for a long time, because I had seen that gesture before, not in a manuscript, not in an archive. In Nasuka, in the early hours of the morning, in the glow of a candle my mother used to light before dawn, when she believed something needed to be done about the threshold, she would trace something on the doorframe with her finger. She never used ink. She never explained. She was a Catholic, devout and serious, and she would have told you, if asked, that it was just something you did, something her own mother did, something older than the reasons for doing it. Standing in that archive, looking at that illustration, I felt the two worlds I had grown up crossing, the academic one my father inhabited and the embodied one my mother carried, collapse into a single point. What she was doing had a name. It had a manuscript tradition. It had parallels in Ethiopia and in Nigeria and in medieval England and in caves that people feared in Nottinghamshire. She had no idea. My father would have filed it under folklore. But the symbol on that page was identical in logic to the gesture her hands made in the dark before sunrise. That is when I understood that this is not superstition. Superstition is an explanation we give to practices we have stopped understanding. This is something else entirely. Let's talk about what the mark actually is. Because if you came here because something was traced on your doorframe and you can't stop thinking about it, or because something in you wants to know what to trace tomorrow morning before the sun touches the wood, you deserve the complete answer. Matthew Champion, whose study of apotropaic marks in historic buildings remains one of the most detailed pieces of documentation work in this field, found something specific in his research. The marks that appeared most consistently in the oldest buildings in England, on doorframes, on windowsills, at the edges of fireplaces, were not random symbols. They were drawn with precision, compass-drawn daisy wheels, hexafoils, intertwined lines that had no endpoint, no place where a malevolent entity could find the beginning or the stopping. The logic was explicit in the historical record. A continuous line was a trap. Something that wanted to cross your threshold would follow the line, because that is what such things do. They follow lines, they look for the entry point, and would be caught inside the loop, confused, unable to find the exit, unable to complete the crossing. What Solomon understood, and what the craftsmen who built English farmhouses in the 16th century also understood, without ever having read a Solomonic manuscript, what my mother in Nsukka understood without anyone telling her in words, is that the act of tracing is not symbolic. The act of tracing is functional. The unbroken line is not a representation of protection. It is the protection, the line drawn with intention before the day begins, before the sun has touched the wood, seals the passage, and you don't need special tools. You don't need materials that are hard to find. You need the discipline of the early hour and the intention of the hand. There is something that happens in the hour before the sun finds your door. Anyone who has been awake at that time, not accidentally, not because the night went wrong, but deliberately, with purpose, knows there is a quality to the silence that doesn't exist at any other point in the day. The world has not yet decided what it will be. The threshold between night and whatever comes after has not yet been crossed. The birds, if there are birds, haven't found their rhythm yet. The sound of the street is absent or distant in a way that feels different from 3 in the morning, less like emptiness and more like held breath. There is dew on surfaces. There is the particular coldness that arrives before warmth reclaims it. The light, if it exists at all, is the kind that doesn't cast shadows yet, because shadows require the sun to have chosen a direction, and the sun has not chosen anything yet. This is the hour that every threshold tradition in every culture has identified as significant. The Solomonic manuscripts call it by different names in different sections, but the logic is consistent. Dawn is not simply the beginning of the day. Dawn is the moment when the terms of the day are still being negotiated, and what you do in that window, what you mark, what you seal, what intention you lay at the threshold, shapes the terms before they are fixed. That is the liminal hour, the in-between, and liminal spaces, doorways, shorelines, the moment between sleeping and waking, have always been understood as the places where the boundary between what is seen and what is unseen becomes thinner. What Solomon was doing when he traced the sign on his doorstep before the sun touched the door was not performing a ritual in the ceremonial sense. He was marking the threshold at the precise moment when it was most vulnerable, the door not yet illuminated, the day not yet decided, the sign placed in that window of uncertainty, so that by the time the light arrived and the day began, the protection was already woven into the wood. This is why the timing matters. It has always been about the timing. Brian Hoggard's work on the archaeology of magic, conducted for Historic England, found the same pattern everywhere the research reached. Protective marks were never placed randomly across a home's surfaces. They were concentrated with striking deliberateness around the points of vulnerability. The doors, the windows, the fireplaces, every place where the sealed interior meets the uncertain exterior. Every place where something could ask to come in. The interior of the home, in this understanding, is not just a physical space. It is a protected space, and the protection has to be actively maintained, not assumed. Every threshold is a question the day asks of the space behind it. The mark is the answer. You are not the first person to feel it. The person who lay awake wondering about the strange circle scratched near their front door. There are thousands of them. People who felt the unease before they had a name for it. People who woke up and found a geometric mark on the frame and couldn't explain why it felt important even before they knew what it was. People whose grandmothers traced something in the air over the threshold at dawn and never explained why, and who spent years trying to understand a gesture that was never put into words. The research team at Creswell Crags found marks that had been there for centuries, ignored and misidentified and almost lost, because the knowledge of what they meant had come apart from the practice of placing them. The gestures survived. The reasons for the gestures stopped being spoken aloud, and then the gestures started to look like superstition from the outside, because without the reason, a gesture is just a movement. But the reason was never gone. It was simply waiting to be found again. George Ferguson, writing on signs and symbols in religious art, documented something that appears across multiple traditions without any apparent cross-pollination: the deliberate use of intertwined unbroken lines near entryways to invoke divine protection. The geometry of the endless knot, the logic of the continuous loop. These appear in contexts as different as Christian architecture, Solomonic practice, and the folk traditions of cultures that had no way of knowing what the others were doing. That convergence is not coincidence. When the same logic surfaces independently across traditions separated by centuries and geography, the logic is pointing at something real. And what it is pointing at is this: the threshold is a technology. The act of marking it at the right time, with the right intention, is the operating of that technology. Here is something that matters. The people who argue that these marks are carpenters' practice runs, or compass exercises, or simple weathering, they have examined the data and arrived at an explanation that fits their framework. That explanation requires ignoring the fact that these marks cluster overwhelmingly and consistently at the specific points of vulnerability in a structure. It requires ignoring the documentation of intent. It requires explaining away the convergence. It is possible to arrive at that explanation, but you have to work at it. What is harder to explain away is the feeling. The pause at the threshold before the sun touches the door, the instinct to look at the frame, the unease that arrived with the house and didn't leave when the locks were checked. Archaeological data is clear that these threshold practices provided something real, not in the sense of measurable spiritual outcomes that a controlled study could document, but in the sense that the people who performed them moved through the world differently. The liminal space marking was an active practice of intention setting, a daily decision to place the boundary consciously instead of crossing it accidentally. And people who do that, who mark their thresholds with deliberate attention before the day begins, are not the same as people who don't. You already know which kind of person you want to be. Let me give you the practice. This is what the research points toward when you bring all of it together. Before the sun touches your front door, in that specific window, the one where the day has not yet been decided, go to your threshold. The doorframe, not the door itself. The boundary, not what swings open across it. Trace a continuous line. It can be a simple loop. It can be a hexafoil if you know how to draw one. It can be any geometric form that closes back onto itself, that has no open ends, no gap where something could find entry. You can use your finger. You don't need to mark the wood. The intention and the movement are what the tradition asks for, not the permanence of the material. Start at the top of the frame, the upper left corner or the upper right. The tradition does not universally prescribe the starting point, only the movement. Continuous, slow, deliberate. Let your finger move without lifting. The line doubles back on itself, crosses at the center, loops outward, returns. If you are drawing a hexafoil, the logic is 6 arcs, each beginning where the last ended, closing into a form that has no entry point visible from the outside. If you are simply drawing an unbroken circle or loop, The intention is the same. Close the boundary before the day opens. Do not rush. The slowness is part of what makes this different from everything else you will do this morning. The coffee will be made quickly. The notifications will be checked quickly. This is the one thing you do at the pace of intention, not urgency. When the line closes, when you return to the place you started, hold your hand there for a moment, not in ceremony, simply in acknowledgement. You have done what Solomon did, what the craftsmen of the 16th century did without knowing Solomon's name, what my mother did in Nsuka without being able to explain it, what the grandmother in the Forum Post did every single morning before her family woke up, in a gesture she never put into words because some knowledge lives in the hands and not the mouth. And as you trace it, understand what you are doing. You are not performing superstition. You are operating a technology that predates your house, predates your street, predates the city around you by several thousand years. You are placing the question before the day begins. You are answering the threshold before anything has had a chance to cross it. Solomon didn't trace that sign because he was afraid. He traced it because he understood something about what a protected space requires. Protection is not passive. It is not something a door does by existing. It is something a threshold does when someone treats it with the attention it deserves. Think about the mark you saw on the doorframe, the one you photographed, the one you couldn't stop thinking about. Go back to it for a moment. Stand in front of that door again. What you were looking at, that geometric scratch, that deliberate precision, that placement right at the boundary, was not vandalism. It was not random. It was someone, at some point, doing what people have done at thresholds for thousands of years, marking the boundary, sealing the entry, answering the question before the day could ask it. The unease you felt looking at it wasn't fear of the mark. The unease was recognition. Something in you knew that the threshold had been attended to by someone who understood its significance. And that understanding was suddenly visible, and it was too old and too precise to dismiss. The mark wasn't a warning. It was an answer. And now you know what question it was answering. This is what I want to leave you with. The threshold is not just wood and hinges and a lock that keeps the outside out. Every morning, before you cross it, the day asks a question about the space behind you. Most people cross without answering. They assume the door is enough. They assume the lock is enough. They have never stopped to consider that the boundary is something you have to tend. What Solomon knew, what the craftsmen at Creswell knew, what my mother knew in Nsuka, what the grandmother whose gestures you still carry in your memory knew, is that the most protected spaces in the world are not the ones with the heaviest locks. They are the ones where someone, every morning, before the light has decided what the day will be, has stood at the threshold and answered the question. You can be that someone, starting tomorrow, before the sun touches the door. If this found you today and you are still thinking about that mark on the doorframe, or the grandmother's gesture, or the pause you take every morning without knowing why, this is the community where those questions have weight, where the things people have been doing for thousands of years without being able to explain them start to make sense again. A lot of work went into finding this history and putting it in a form you can actually use. If this video gave you something real, a name for something you've been feeling, a practice to take into tomorrow morning, super thanks is the way to let that land. It keeps this research going and signals to YouTube that this kind of content deserves to reach more people who need it. Every small act of support makes the next video possible. And before you go, I want to know something specific. In the comments below, write what you would do differently at your threshold tomorrow morning if you trusted that the timing actually mattered. Not what you think you should say, what you would actually change. The best answers to this question have come from people who have been sitting with this longer than they expected. Let's find out where you are.